So Matt, very glad to have you here. Online, we have Bjartmar Alexanderson. Bjartmar is a, hello Bjartmar, I can see you now. It's funny, for those of you who are watching online, the screen is behind me, so I can't actually see Bjartmar's face, but I can see the reactions on people's faces in front of me. But Bjartmar is an investigative journalist working with Stundin. Before that, he was an environmental campaigner. So somebody who understands why it is that we need to really understand what's going on behind closed doors. Alongside him on the screen, you can see Lauri Love. Lauri, as many of you will know, is a highly capable security analyst, information security analyst, sorry, who has really changed how we think of hackers and hacktivism. And his work, both within the Occupy campaign and thereafter, have been inspiring a number of young activists. So we're very glad to have Lauri here, although he's working off a slightly different time zone. So I hope he's still awake, because this is in the middle of the night potentially for him. So thank you, Lauri and Bjartmar, for joining us online. I'm going to start firstly by asking a few questions to Matt, and then I'll move on to Lauri and Bjartmar. But I would also welcome any questions from the audience. We're going to run this session in a little bit of a discussion style, because I know there are people around the room who've also been following the case for a while. So I'll start off by reminding people who may not have been that close to WikiLeaks at the start that WikiLeaks was really very important when we changed from a situation where we had a huge amount of print journalism through to a situation where we began to move towards more digitized journalism. And we moved to an age where things were being done online, and there were vast amounts of data that were being used by nation states in terms of their analysis of intelligence. WikiLeaks provided a new and independent platform that allowed whistleblowers to get in touch with journalists. What was interesting about WikiLeaks was it was the first organization to offer what you can now see in most newspapers, which is a secure Dropbox-like facility where people can put in information, vast quantities of information. The other thing that was quite unusual about WikiLeaks is that this Dropbox was not just secure for the person providing it, but also secure in terms of the documentation that went through it. So it was secure for the whistleblower, secure in terms of the documentation, and there was a change in the way in the way whistleblowers interacted with the media, because they could interact through WikiLeaks with very large organizations like the New York Times or the Guardian or the Washington Post, and also interact with smaller organizations, for example, in Tunisia, where WikiLeaks' revelations were used by a local news organization to help change the political leadership there, and by activists in that jurisdiction. WikiLeaks has covered corruption in Kenya, through to Trafigura dumps off the Ivory Coast, through to a range of other environmental, social, war crimes types issues. And the big, when WikiLeaks really burst onto the scene in terms of public consciousness, is from Chelsea Manning's dumps in some ways. So I'd like to start by asking you, Matt, how did journalism change with WikiLeaks?
Thank you, Deepa. It's good to be here. I mean, really, WikiLeaks revolutionized journalism completely. I mean, journalism was a different thing before WikiLeaks came on the scene. You've had centuries where the establishment press has basically controlled the information that goes out to the population en masse. And you have establishment journalists filtering the information they're getting from government, from corporations, for the people. WikiLeaks was a different idea. It was about giving the information unfiltered to the people so they could find out what was going on themselves. I mean, it was one of the most democratic acts that's ever been done. It was publishing all those US cables online, you know, because this is information that citizens need to understand what their governments are doing. And the state does not want us to have information which doesn't fit in with the narratives they put out themselves, but also put out through the media. So inevitably, when you're doing something like Julian Assange did with WikiLeaks, he was going to come up against some powerful forces, and we've seen what's happened to him subsequent. He's been in prison in Belmarsh for 2 years and counting now, on charges relating to the Chelsea Manning releases, which revealed war crimes, corporate crimes, government crimes. Every possible crime you can think of was revealed in that leak, as well as the Iraq and Afghan war logs. So, I mean, it's hard to say now, because it seems like the state, in terms of the UK and the US, has put WikiLeaks back in a box, which was what they wanted to do from the start. But I don't think it's going to last, you know, like it inspired millions of people all over the world, arguably started the Arab Spring. So the power of information, the power of giving people information unfiltered is out there. It's out the box now. So there'll be copycats, there'll be ways to get round the state backlash, which we're seeing now. I mean, in terms of my personal experience, I remember when the Cablegate happened and the collateral murder, I was working for the Financial Times in Washington, DC. And that point, I remember my disillusionment with the corporate media really started, because I was working inside it. I was a reporter covering the White House and the EPA and different agencies. And I saw the reaction of other journalists in the FT office in Washington. And it was not a sort of celebration that, okay, this journalist has managed to get all this information out that was previously secret and really exposes government wrongdoing, which you'd sort of assume would be the reaction of journalists who thought their job was to expose the powers that be, but it wasn't that. So at that point, I thought, wow, this is so revealing. You know, if establishment journalists are actually taking the side of the state against journalists who's exposing them, then what is the media for? You know, and essentially that started a process which ended with me leaving the Financial Times and understanding that the corporate media and the establishment media, its role is to protect the state largely. It largely functions as an arm of the state. There's definitely exceptions, and there are moments to be celebrated, such as the Pentagon Papers and Snowden. But there are exceptions. On a day-to-day basis, the role of the corporate media, the establishment media, is to protect the state and to amplify its messaging. And that's how power systems work. They co-opt any kind of critical information against them and try and neuter it. So WikiLeaks, Julian Assange couldn't be controlled. That's the other thing. Is that there's not many people in the world. In fact, you could probably count them on both hands that would be able to sustain the amount of pressure that man came under for years on end. And we don't know how he is now, but they've tried so hard to break him and destroy him, but he's still alive. So yeah, in that respect. And then after the Financial Times, this is quite a revealing story as well. I wrote a book about my time at the Financial Times, and essentially what it was a book of my FT articles where I filled in the blanks. So I put in all the stuff that I knew I couldn't put in when I was at the FT, all the information from interviews that I knew wouldn't ever get printed. And a large part of the information I got to fill in the blanks came from the WikiLeaks cable releases. So, for example, I went to Haiti. The FT sent me to Haiti in 2011 to do a story about the aftermath of the earthquake, which had happened the year previous. And I tried to get I did get a few critical things in, but I went to a sweatshop, for example, which was funded by the US government and had all these corporations working there. I interviewed the boss of the sweatshop, and I wrote about it, and I published the article on the FT. I'm not particularly proud of it today. It's not something I would share, But what was interesting is when I was writing that book, I typed in that sweatshop and that special economic zone, it was called, into WikiLeaks searchable database and found reams of information about what the true reality of what was happening at that sweatshop. So there were arguments with the trade union, which obviously the boss hadn't mentioned. It had been built on land which had been inhabited by people, and this was all in the cables. So I managed to just write that all in, and then anyone reading that chapter had a real view of what was happening in the world. And that is what WikiLeaks did. It allowed us all to have access to information that we need to understand how the world really works. And you can't get that in the corporate media. In fact, the corporate media is set up to stop you understanding the world as it is. It gives you a lot of information, but a lot of it's distraction, stuff you don't need to know. And a lot of the stuff that we need to know is just not in it. I'll finish with this. One interesting example which happened last week, which I found was, again, very revealing, was the Royal Navy recruited Daniel Craig, the actor, to be some officer in the Royal Navy, and it was written about all over the corporate media. Basically, word for word, the UK military press release was repeated, and everyone who was reading that media would have thought this is kind of this is what the Royal Navy's up to. It's not. It's a kind of cuddly organisation that doesn't do anything. But in reality, the Royal Navy is a key facilitator of the Saudi blockade of Yemen, which has created the world's worst humanitarian disaster, millions of kids on the brink of starvation. Not one media outlet has ever investigated the Royal Navy's role, apart from Declassified UK, which I work for, and my colleague Phil Miller did a whole story about it, revealing it. It wasn't picked up in one mainstream media outlet. So that shows you all the information you need to get a real understanding of the world is left out. All the stuff that is conducive to power is left in. So WikiLeaks upset that whole thing and started a revolution in journalism, which goes on. And as I say, they won't be able to shut it down eventually.
Thanks, Matt. I think that's really important. One of the interesting things about WikiLeaks, other than the Dropbox, is this scientific approach to archival, which was not really very well developed before WikiLeaks. What this meant was, not only did you have raw data, largely unredacted, but you were able to go back when there were, for example, declassified documentations. You were able to go back to the original data and fill in the blanks. And that was really crucial in the case of Khalid al-Masri, who's a German citizen who was abducted on the Macedonian border while on holiday. He was on a holiday bus. He was abducted by 8 CIA agents. He was then tortured, reindicted to a CIA black site, where some really horrendous things. He was sodomized. He was treated, terribly. And after about 3 months, they realized that he was not the Khalid al-Masri they wanted to abduct. So this man had been taken out, completely out of circulation. What did they do when they realized that Khalid al-Masri wasn't the person they wanted? They had an internal political struggle. This internal political struggle meant he continued to be in captivity for much longer before he was released in the middle of the night on the Albanian border, where he was released naked, and he thought he was going to be shot in the back of the head. The Albanian police then picked him up, repatriated him to Germany. But when he came to Germany, nobody would believe that this indeed had happened to him. In fact, his family and with young children had moved back to Lebanon, thinking he had abandoned them. The German state knew this was going on, but the United States put pressure on the German state not to prosecute the 8 CIA agents and not to recognize what had happened to Mr. al-Masri. It was only thanks to the WikiLeaks releases in the diplomatic cables and elsewhere that they found out what was happening to Mr. al-Masri, and Mr. al-Masri got some amount of restitution through the European Court of Human Rights. To this day, Mr. al-Masri's voice has been shut down, even in the court in the UK, where he was there to offer testimony in the case of Assange, where all of a sudden the video link or the audio link didn't work. So it is. Thank you. So it is thanks to WikiLeaks releases that these kinds of grave injustices, including Guantanamo, which now it remains open 2 decades after the war on terror was started, where a number of innocent civilians have been taken, waterboarded, tortured, rectally fed peanuts. This kind of gruesome torture has taken place, and we wouldn't have known about it were it not for WikiLeaks. And were it not for the genius of Julian Assange in being able to marry both journalism and technology. And I'd like to move for my second question to Lauri, if you're able, Lauri. One of the other things that's always puzzled me about this whole process is how Julian has felt through this process, which is that it must be quite difficult for somebody who has never committed a criminal act to have been persecuted for over 10 years. And it must have been particularly difficult. And I know, Lauri, you and I have talked about this before, about how somebody like that feels when they're going through an extradition process. Are you able to tell us a little bit about your own experience of the US extradition?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so for people that don't know, I was put through the same wrangler of terror that is being subjected to an extradition request from the United States, despite having never been there, and being accused of committing crimes in various states, somehow remotely, while being in the United Kingdom and facing up to 99 years in prison. So basically the prospect of being carted off, manhandled onto a plane and taken to America and put in a small box and kept in inhumane conditions probably for the rest of my natural life, and it's not a nice prospect when you sort of spell it out like that, especially when the things that you're accused of doing were protest actions, activism in the public interest. But it's harrowing, not only because of that horrible outcome that you're having to consider in a long, drawn-out length of time that, in my case, was about 5 years. Julian's been having to consider this eventuality while in some or other form of detention for over 10 years now, and also just how Kafkaesque the process is. So Kafka wrote these novels about where the theme was that the system is completely stacked against you, and it's kind of dark and twisted, and it really was like that in Westminster Magistrates Court, where you have to sit in the little goldfish bowl dock and listen to allegations that form the basis of the extradition request, which do not have to be evidenced. So we have this very interesting arrangement just with the United States, not with any other country. The extradition treaty was revised by under Tony Blair and David Blunkett with George Bush in the war on terror to remove the need for establishing a prima facie case. So there's no actual requirement for the United States to demonstrate anything in its allegations when trying to extradite someone. So it's very, I don't know if I can really sort of quite give justice to just how bizarre it is to sit and know that you cannot contest lies, fabrications and distortions that are being spoken with the intent of tearing you away from your life, your family and your friends overseas to a country that you have no connection to, whose laws you were never subject to, that you didn't agree to be put in a small room and kept in inhumane conditions for the rest of your life to try and set an example that other people should not stand up to power. So yeah, this is kind of, it's pretty horrific, I I guess, in some way.
And I can see, the impact on you personally has been humongous, over the years, in terms of how it's affected your health. And in Julian's case, I was doing some research today, and many of you will know how painful a sore tooth is. But Julian had a cracked tooth while he was in the embassy, and he was not allowed permission, despite the doctor saying he needed a root canal and additional dental treatment. He was not allowed to go to a hospital. He also had a frozen shoulder, and he continues to have a shoulder condition, which has been diagnosed for about 9 years now. And he has not been allowed to have medical treatment. So there has been the psychological torture of the isolation when you're smeared and mislabeled. There's also been a huge amount of psychological torture, knowing, particularly in the court case, knowing there's no light at the end of the tunnel. It is like an indefinite sentence, because as far as Julian is concerned, we don't know when he will get out of Belmarsh, if only to be put on a plane to go to the US. And there's also this, the psychological torture associated with constantly being surveilled in that embassy and nobody believing in. I mean, I remember the newspaper headlines, I don't know if you do, Matt, which talked about, oh, he's imagining it. He has an overinflated sense of himself. That's why he thinks he's being spied on. But actually...
I can talk to this.
Yeah, please, Larry, please do.
I visited Julian in the embassy a couple of times, once after the death of the mutual friend Gavin McFadden, a famous investigative journalist, and a couple of other times, and Julian would sort of point to the ceiling and say, kind of intimate that they're watching. And this was when he was still on relatively good terms with the embassy staff. And I thought, is this sort of paranoia? Is this overblown? And then it's come out recently through a case in the courts in Spain that actually the security company that was hired by the embassy to provide security was co-opted by a front company for the CIA, and they had broken international diplomatic law and arrangements and understandings of international relations, and surveilled him continuously. All of the people that visited had their passports and their devices examined and interfered with and copied, which is a lot of journalists, human rights people, activists, and so there's a long tail of interference of this. But it also completely undermines his any kind of pretense that there was a fair legal system happening here, because the Rights Council was breached, and somehow this hasn't been apposite. This hasn't been able to be raised in the extradition hearings, despite it kind of making a mockery of justice.
Thanks, Larry. I mean, I think that's really true, because here we expect due process. We expect a certain amount of attorney-client privilege. Well, not a certain amount. We expect attorney-client privilege not to be breached. But in Julian's case, conversations with his lawyer, Gareth Pearce, and conversations with a number of medical professionals who were examining him were taped and provided via Sheldon Adelson's firm. And for those of you who'd like to look at this, you can look at it on the Grey Zone. Max Blumenthal has done an excellent piece of work on it. But talking about the way the judicial process has worked, Matt, you've done a lot of work on the conflicts of interest within the judiciary, especially the conflicts of interest of Judge Emma Arbuthnot. Would you like to tell us a little bit about it? Because I was amazed by the amount of information you managed to unearth, which continues to be ignored through this day. Because when they discovered that the CIA were bugging Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, the case was thrown out. But in Julian's case, he's been spied upon, nobody cares. The judges have conflicts of interest, nobody cares. And Bjartmar is going to tell us a little bit about the prime FBI witness. But before that, Matt, over to you.
I mean, in some ways, the role of the British judiciary and the legal system here is perhaps the scariest part of the whole of the Assange case. Because yes, the CIA was spying on him. All this surveillance was happening of human rights activists, journalists, people visiting him. But what the case in terms of the legal process here has shown is that the British judiciary has been captured by the state. And there is perhaps no more sure sign of authoritarianism than a legal system captured by the state. And it's incontrovertible. I mean, you kind of assume it's the case because you know about how the British establishment works. But I started looking into this case a couple of years ago, and it's wild. As Deepa mentioned, when Ellsberg had his psychiatrist's office burglarized by the Nixon administration because they were looking for information with which to smear him in the media, his case with the Pentagon Papers was thrown out. And that was that should have happened already with Julian Assange's case. You have the CIA, the intelligence agency, the government behind his prosecution, spying on his privileged conversations with his lawyers. There's nothing more corrupted in a legal case than that. It should be thrown out immediately. It hasn't been. But as Deepa mentioned, it goes much deeper than that. You have, from the start, there's been massive conflicts of interest. Deepa mentioned Lady Emma Arbuthnot, who made two key rulings on the Assange case in February 2018, where she basically said that his bail violation conviction wouldn't be lifted, so which meant he couldn't negotiate safe passage to Ecuador. And she was chief magistrate of Westminster at that point. She's not anymore. She's now gone to the appeals court, which is where the case is going to be heard next month. Yeah, exactly. But anyway, so she made those cases, and then she was the senior judge in Westminster, overseeing her junior judges, including Vanessa Baraitser, who made the final decision. And her husband is Lord Arbuthnot. Sorry. Yeah, her husband is Lord Arbuthnot, who is a Tory Lord, former defence minister, who has multiple links to the British and intelligence and military establishment. He was director of a company with the former head of MI6, Sir John Scarlett. He was on the political council of Henry Jackson Society while it was running a media campaign against Assange at the time of his wife making rulings in court against Assange. Her son is the vice president of an investment house which is heavily invested in a company called Darktrace, which was set up by MI5 and GCHQ to stop data leaks. So you get the image, and it goes much deeper. An interesting story I did more recently, which is another facet of this case, which is barely discussed, and I can't get my head around that either, is the fact that he is a political prisoner. Because the political dimensions of this, we had this article out today which showed the CIA had drawn up plans to kidnap or kill him in London. The UK government's role is very interesting as well. And actually, I put in a lot of freedom of information requests for information about the UK government's role in the case, and it was always came back rejected. And actually, the former UK Foreign Minister, Alan Duncan, released his diaries recently. And that was the first window we really had into the machinations behind getting the UK government's campaign to get Assange and hand him to the Americans. And it was stunning. Alan Duncan, he was the chief negotiator for the UK government with the Ecuadorians, and he basically pushed them harder and harder. And when they eventually got him out, he flew to Quito, the capital of Ecuador, and gave Lenin Moreno, the president, who had kicked Assange out, a plate from Buckingham Palace gift shop. His quote was to say thank you for what he'd done for the British. So that's not a normal political case. You don't get ministers in governments going and thanking presidents for handing them to Belmarsh maximum security prison. So the political dimension is massive. Alan Duncan also noted a meeting he had with Theresa May where he said that he told her to butter up, that was his words, butter up President Moreno to get Assange out. So you have the whole UK government working on behalf of the US to get him out. You have the US government planning to assassinate or kidnap him in London. It's complete madness. It's complete. And this is why the Assange case is so important because so much of this is getting normalized. When I'm saying this, I hope people here are probably feeling the like some sort of fear, like where have we gone? But it doesn't get out into the mainstream, and that's what scares me so much. Is that when our freedoms are being taken away, the Assange case shows civil society it's not going to do its job. They won't stand up. They're not standing up for Assange, and he's an unpopular figure now because of years of character assassination. But that's how governments, states take rights away. They start with unpopular people, and people don't stand up for them. And then the precedent's set, and they'll take out other people. That's how it works. So they're doing all this in broad daylight. Alan Duncan's diaries was published. It was barely remarked upon by the media at all. He talked about having a party after the day they got Assange out the embassy at the Foreign Office, it was called Operation Pelican, this operation to get Assange out. He was talking about how one of the police officers had a tie with a pelican on it. I mean, they're celebrating. So it's highest levels of corruption in our society, and I ask everyone to have a look into it, because if they get Assange, they can get anyone, and there is no better way of understanding who runs Britain than looking at this case, because all the stuff we're taught in civics class and democratic theory is that the judiciary is independent, journalists are protected. It's all an illusion if you start pushing what is acceptable, or if it's like that famous Rosa Luxemburg quote, isn't it? Those who aren't moving don't notice their chains. And that's why everyone can go around saying, "Oh, I'm free. I can write in the corporate media. I can write what I want. I can publish what I want. We have a free press." But then, what about Julian Assange? Those people aren't shaking their chains, whereas he obviously did, and we saw what happened to him. So, this is the thing about the Assange case. It's not about it is about Julian Assange because he's a human being who did a heroic act. But it's also about us. It's about us as a society. It's about us as a civilization. Do we want to be a people that allows people like Tony Blair, George W. Bush to prance around on TV after they've launched an illegal war, doctored intelligence to convince a population into an illegal war, killed thousands of US and UK troops, killed 1 million Iraqis? No, they've not spent a day in court in their lives. The only person that spent a day in court is Julian Assange, and obviously Chelsea Manning as well, the two people that did more than anyone to expose their crimes. That is George Orwell. We're already living in that world. The war criminals are free and celebrated. The people who exposed them are in holes in the ground and ignored by the media. So yeah, I'll finish there. That's not very optimistic.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, it's good you mentioned that as well, because this is another facet of when I say the legal process, it's not just the judiciary, it's also the public prosecutor, which is the CPS. And Keir Starmer was director of public prosecutions from 2008 to 2013. The latter part of that, the last 3 years of that, was when basically the most important time for the Swedish case. And he had a huge role. Well, we don't know what his personal role was, but his CPS, what has been revealed, was actively trying to stop the Swedes coming to London to interview Assange in the embassy, because they didn't want it to be resolved. They wanted him to stay in the embassy and pull him out and send him to the Americans. So Starmer's role we don't know anything about, because, and this goes back to what I was saying about journalism before, Starmer, we have a journalist who's imprisoned in Belmarsh. He was imprisoned in an embassy because he was under threat of persecution by the US government. The leader of the Labour Party was a huge player in the case. Not one mainstream journalist has ever asked him about it, ever. How that's crazy. That's madness. So, but that's how this kind of this brainwashing operates. That things that aren't conducive to powerful forces are completely omitted. So no one even knows, like, because you've read up on it, but your average Joe in the street will have no idea that Starmer had a role, will have no idea that the CPS, which is meant to be an independent organization, was a key player in stopping the Assange case being resolved before he was put in Belmarsh. So yeah, it's rotten to the core across all elements of the British justice system, from the CPS to the Westminster Magistrates Court, to Belmarsh prison itself. Why is he there? Why is he in Belmarsh? It's a maximum security prison for category A and category B prisoners, but violent ones. One of the stories I did for Declassified was I got a list through the Freedom of Information Act of all the offences of all the people that were in Belmarsh. Over 25% of them are in there for murder. 2/3 are in there for violent offences. Why is Assange in there? Why is he in there? He's not a threat to the public. He could be anywhere. They're punishing him. And that's what's scary. They don't even need to give an excuse because no one ever asked them. Why is he in Belmarsh?
Thanks, Matt. Yep. Indeed. And we asked Keir Starmer, Ruth and I were at the same CLP meeting, DC meeting, where we asked Keir Starmer about this, and he lied to our faces. And then the chair muted us so that we couldn't have a discussion about it. This is the Labour Party today, and this is why we're having this fest today. I'd like to move to another aspect of good investigative journalism, credible investigative journalism, which is Bjartmar, you've waited very patiently. Thank you very much for joining us from Iceland today. Bjartmar Alexandersson, who works for Stundin, which is a newspaper in Iceland, put out a huge expose recently, which is about one of the main witnesses the FBI has used. And this is a gentleman called Sigurdur Thordarson. And Bjartmar, I would be grateful if you could tell us a little bit about Siggy and what you found out about him and how that relates to the Assange case, please.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, the Mr. Sigurður is actually Mr. Sigurður Ingi Þórðarson. He actually changed his name by taking out his middle name because it's better to be able to con here in Iceland money out of companies. But Mr. Sigurður Þórðarson is actually a known con artist here in Iceland. And also he has been in the court system for sexual abuse of minors. So we all know this character here in Iceland. We have written about him in several stories. But for some strange reason, the FBI decided to use these individuals as their star witness. And in the indictment against Mr. Assange, his testimony is used to basically transform him from a journalist to a hacker. And in the indictment, there are several pieces of evidence, as the FBI says, that Mr. Assange asked Mr. Þórðarson to break the law and hack individuals and even the Icelandic parliament. Well, through my investigations, I have actually seen that there is no evidence of this. And I actually, in conversations with Mr. Þórðarson, over 9 hours of it, it seems that the indictment is basically a lie. And all the evidence that we found, the chat logs, the police reporting here in Iceland, in police investigations, my interviews with ministers here in Iceland, and especially the Minister of Interior, it shows that there's no evidence behind many of these indictment cases inside the indictment.
Thank you. And that's really interesting, because initially, Julian was supposedly in Belmarsh for bail jumping. And to term asylum-seeking bail jumping is a joke in itself. But then he was kept in Belmarsh because he was said to be a bail jumper. But I remember in court, Judge Baraitser specifically said that she didn't want to give Mr. Assange's lawyers time to look at the information, which was in the last indictment was served on the first day of the trial. So Julian was given a laptop to prepare for the hearings with the keys glued down. This was the preparatory material. And this reminds me of the case of al-Nashiri in Guantanamo, where his lawyers asked for a laptop for him when finally he came before the military commission. And the reason they gave for the laptop was that the cage in which he was held could not hold the volume of paper required for the evidence that was being provided against him. In Julian's case, the evidence runs into several hundreds of thousands of pages. And he was given this laptop with the keys glued down after a major struggle. And even when the judge talked about this in court, she kept saying, oh, but we want Mr. Assange, who was in Belmarsh, to have a fair trial. That's why we're progressing at this speed. Yet when they came to the final decision and she decided not to extradite him, not on grounds of freedom of press, not on any other grounds, but purely on grounds of the fact that he might commit suicide were he to be extradited, and because of the oppressive prison conditions in the US. She also denied him bail on grounds that she wanted the US to be able to fairly contest the case during the appeal. And the idea was that were he to be released, he might bail jump again. And this bail jumping has been a recurring theme. And it's, as Matt said, it ties into the involvement of the UK judiciary in this, because right from the start, the UK judiciary have never recognized the threat to Julian's life while he was outside the embassy and while he was in the embassy. And these threats have then been used to say, oh no, he was bail jumping. And while they were using this bail jumping illusion, they have managed to keep him in prison 2 years after the end of the first bail jumping conviction. He's now only on remand for the last 2 years. So, and in isolation 22 hours a day, much like another great journalist and whistleblower, Craig Murray, who sits in Edinburgh's Saughton prison and who has done, whom we all send solidarity to, I think, from here, given his circumstances. I'm going to stop there with our questions and discussions and take some questions from the audience online and also the audience in the room. I'll go to Ruth first, because if you'll bear with me 1 second, Ruth, we'll just manage to get a mic across to you. Tina or Esther will be. Thank you.
I was going to ask that question that you asked, but in the meantime, I hope this won't seem like I'm being hostile, but I have, right from the beginning of the Assange case, wondered how he had the courage to break US secrets when he must have known how much danger he would be in and how much security he would need to protect himself. Surely he knew that this onslaught would happen if he did what no one else had done before. Can you answer that question?
It's a good question, but maybe Laurie might want to answer that.
I think it comes down to principle. I think that once he realized the potential of the technology of the internet to enable this radical change in journalism, this revolution in journalism, to connect people directly with the truth in terms of unmediated, vetted, validated source documents. I think at that point you can't really hold back. You have to. The die is cast, as they say, and no, that doesn't mean that he was reckless or cavalier. I think it was just bravery and courage to try and do this, and nobody quite expected the deep, cynical nature of the way the United States played, not the United States as a whole, but the vested power that was exposed by WikiLeaks. Played dirty and used all kinds of tricks and shenanigans to get him, subterfuge and breaking all of the rules and conventions. And it was predictable that there would be some blowback, but the way it was actually unfolded should surprise and should appall us, and should just raise our anger and righteous indignation. And so I don't think we should try and normalize it by saying that it's to be expected. I think we should hope for, agitate for, and fight for a world where speaking truth to power is not just protected, but applauded and guaranteed and defended by us all.
Thanks, Larry. And I think to some extent, your question is, why do whistleblowers stand out? Why do people like Craig Murray tell us about torture in Uzbekistan? Why does Chelsea Manning tell us about killings in Iraq? Why do all these people do what will naturally result? I mean, we can see from Eileen Chubb at the Bupa 7 or so many other people who have made great personal sacrifices in order to tell us the truth. I think there is a sense of responsibility and courage. And one of the things that's always in the documentation I've seen about Julian, he's always been very realistic about what they can do to him and understood the power of the state and yet chosen to do it. But I wondered if we could turn the table slightly and ask you, Matt, what motivates you to do the kind of confrontational journalism that you're doing? Because clearly when Declassified was told earlier this year, was it that the MOD will blacklist you and you wouldn't be allowed to talk to them. This is your bread and butter. What encourages you to do these things?
Yeah, I mean, we are what we do is we do traditional journalism in the sense of we base most of our stories on freedom of information requests and declassified documents and stuff. So we're not doing that sort of journalism. But obviously, there's a backlash across the world against traditional journalism as well. I mean, you saw what happened to The Guardian after they published the Snowden documents. There were GCHQ officials went into their offices and smashed up laptops, which is something you'd expect to happen in like Belarus or Saudi Arabia or something, but that happened in the heart of London. And I think that, as we know, the sort of US empire is in trouble. You know, economically, it's getting overtaken by China. It's got this massive comparative advantage in that it's got this huge military, which is untouchable. Spends more. The rest of the world combined doesn't spend as much as the US on arms. So their real problem, the US empire, is an internal problem, and it's the same here to a degree. So there's going to be a move to restrict freedoms which we've enjoyed that allow us to critically analyze and scrutinize what they do, because they see it as a threat to the smooth running of their operations. The UK government in their propaganda often talk about force for good, you know, this new propaganda campaign about the UK being a force for good, and they've got a media freedom campaign as well, which is which they're doing globally, which is kind of slavishly repeated by the corporate media. But it's all rubbish, and actually those powers that be see critical journalism as a threat to them. They don't want information exposed which contradicts the narratives they put out. In the case of Declassified, we got blacklisted by the Ministry of Defence merely for doing stories about the UK's role in the war in Yemen. GCHQ blacklisted us for doing a story about their program in schools. But I mean, it's a different kind of threat. You know, there are some norms in British society. They've managed to kind of move Assange outside the kind of sphere of journalism. I think everyone in the UK kind of there's a norm that supports journalists not going to prison. And in fact, it hasn't really happened before, you know, for a long time that a journalist Duncan Campbell went on trial in the 70s for revealing the existence of GCHQ. But since then, up to Assange, there hasn't been anyone put in prison. What's the way that they've done it is, as Deepa was talking about, they've criminalized the whistleblowers. So you sign a act or a piece of legislation, you have to sign on when you get access to classified information. If you hand that information over to a journalist, you're prosecuted, right? That's been the way it's been from Ellsberg to Snowden. Now what is happening is that they're trying to blur the distinction between whistleblowers and journalists. And there's this very worrying Home Office consultation that was published recently where they came up with proposals for reforming the Official Secrets Act of 1989, which hasn't been reformed since then. But they say they want to update it for a new information age. But what it says is that now, well, this isn't legislation, this is a proposal, but it's likely they will go on to be part of legislation, or at least in some form. And the recommendation that the Home Office made was that journalists can be put in prison for publishing information which they deem to damage national security. And the consultation paper says with a prison sentence of up to 14 years. So that's totally new. And if that goes through, then that is basically the nail in the coffin for any kind of freedom we have, because, and I think it is a prelude to fascism, because fascism is all about the state telling you, we know the truth, we know what's in your best interest, we know how to keep you safe, you can't argue with that, you obey, right? That's and actually what journalism, national security stuff especially, is saying, well, actually journalists have the right to, if they see information which is in the public interest, alert their fellow citizens of it. Whereas if that legislation goes through, the government basically says, we know the truth, you obey us, if you don't do that, you're going to go to prison. And to me, that sounds a lot like fascism, right? So I think that the way that I think it's Assange, definitely what he did, well, his journalism is a different type of journalism. He's a computer scientist, he's a journalist, but it was a new type of journalism. But they've criminalized him, but what they want to do is criminalize this traditional reporting as well, because that's also a threat. I mean, you look, The Guardian, obviously we know what it's like now, but in 2013, they did a real service to humanity by publishing the Snowden documents. Not many newspapers would have done that. And I know that the editor, Alan Rusbridger, came under intense pressure for publishing those documents. I don't know if they would do that now. I don't. And that is because there was a backlash, and the state wants to stamp out any critical spaces in society. As we know, the Labour Party, that's one of their, they've managed to do that in the Labour Party. Obviously, they've completely destroyed any kind of democracy and dissent in the Labour Party. But it's the same. They want to do the same thing to the rest of society, and journalism is a part of that.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to take two more questions from the audience, one from Tina, and then thereafter, I'm going to come to you, Chris, because you were one of the first MPs to introduce, you were the first MP to introduce anything in Parliament on the subject of Assange. So Tina, and then Chris, I'd be grateful if you could say a few words about what's happening in Parliament.
Yeah, I'm involved in Labour Against the Witch Hunt, and I was exactly going to point to what Matt was saying at the end. Like this is not happening in isolation, isn't it? The Assange thing, the right to protest is under threat. We are, you have to impose the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, otherwise you get defunded. You're not allowed to criticize Israel anymore. There is a huge attacks going on at the moment. I'm not sure I agree with you that it's a threat of fascism, because, you know, historically, at least, that's because the working class was so powerful. You had to crush it. At the moment, I think it's more what you said earlier. I think it's internal contradictions of capitalism are really coming to a head now. The American century is over. Even Joe Biden said that. That was quite interesting for pulling out the troops of Afghanistan. But capitalism is, as a system, is clearly, there's so many irrationalities happening at the moment where things don't seem to make much sense. I mean, you know, a fuel shortage and stuff like that. Trains not, I mean, it's just ridiculous that it cannot resolve its own contradictions. So, you know, the logical thing would be socialism, but unfortunately our forces are very, very weak. But it did, when you were talking about, you know, making all these the sacrifices that Julian has made. And it reminds me, we've been trying to put on meetings as, you know, the left, and you'll have left MPs not speaking in a meeting where the word anti-Semitism is used, the word anti-Semitism, not even saying anything about Israel, etc. The lack of courage on the left, on these official lefts, is just it's just pathetic, especially if you compare it to somebody like Julian or Snowden, or people who are really risking their lives and their livelihood, etc. What's going on in the Labour movement is much more, you know, the self-censorship, and that's of course the point. That's of course the point of sending Julian Assange to Belmarsh, is to stop people like you. It's not working with you, but it's working with plenty of other journalists and MPs and etc. And that is unfortunately as well in the Labour movement is the horrific thing is how people fold one after the other. And the only MP who did stand up is, of course, Chris, and we fought with him side by side, but everybody else is shameful. Momentum, CLPD. These are shameful, a lack of courage, etc. So it's really good, comrades, people, speakers like you are daring to come here and stand on platform with the expelled and with those who've been, deemed anti-Semites for being critical of Israel. But this is a whole big international campaign, the Assange, right to protest, anti-Semitism, Israel. It's all connected. It's all quite horrific. There's no easy answers how to oppose it, but we have to understand this is a system in decline on its last legs, and we have to organize to give it the final push.
Thanks, Tina. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. And 3 great contributions, and thank you for that. And particular thanks to Matt, because when I was under the cosh and the eye of the storm, as it were, Matt showed me solidarity and support, and it was really encouraging. And of course, you, Deepa, as well. I remember going to one of the meetings in support of Julian, a sort of planning campaign meeting, and both Matt and Deepa were there, and it's great to experience that solidarity, because it was sorely lacking from the Parliamentary Labour Party. But I think the situation in relation to the lack of support from from parliaments across the whole, really, but particularly the Parliamentary Labour Party, in a way, it was another example of the scales being removed from my eyes. I always looked at the Labour Party through rose-tinted spectacles. I'd been a member of the Labour Party since 1976 and had given my life to the Labour Party, and absolutely, admired and respected key figures in the Labour Party. I'd like to think some of the key figures historically would have been stronger than the present crop of individuals that are in the Parliamentary Labour Party. But when I talk about the scales being removed in relation to the lack of support for Julian, it illustrated that the Parliamentary Labour Party, if not the Labour Party as a whole, is a tool of the establishment. And it's also an indication as to why we must not put all our faith in elected leaders, or indeed in representative democracy. It frankly isn't fit for purpose. When we talk about representative democracy, it's pretty clear to me that the people that they're representing is not us. It's not the public. It's not the 99%. It's the elites. It's the establishment. It's a military industrial complex. And it's an utterly shameful state of affairs that when I tabled the motion in support of Julian Assange, who is an international hero, who's done an incredible service, I think, in what he did, unparalleled, really, for the Labour Party, I saw the Labour Party, to not be four square behind him, throwing their absolute support, and indeed, for Jeremy and for Diane Abbott, who Jeremy made one statement in a tweet when Julian was dragged from the Ecuadorian embassy, and Diane made one statement on the floor of the chamber. But that was it. There was nothing else, and it's just not good enough. And as I say, there were I think 5 people in total, and I was one of them that signed that motion. And I think it was only 1 or possibly 2 Labour MPs. Now, clearly, people are fearful or whatever, but I think it illustrates the task ahead of us. And that is that we have to rely on ourselves, and we have to build a movement, it seems to me, to bring pressure to bear, not just in support of Julian, really, but for so many of the issues that we all care deeply about. And our parliamentary institution is absolutely not fit for purpose. The Parliamentary Labour Party is not fit for purpose. And I often keep quoting the line from the Red Flag, which talks about cowards flinching and traitors sneering. That is the Parliamentary Labour Party. It's made up entirely of cowards and traitors.
Thank you, Chris. We'll pass the mic to the lady in front. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. I'd just like to say, from a grassroots perspective, I can remember, and I'm in a left-wing constituency, in the constituency next to Jeremy. We all have close ties in that area of Diane Abbott, and literally the left turned It was a very clever tactic by the establishment. They completely disregarded Julian because of the sexual. And I used to say, well, okay, if he did that, that's another issue. But look at the actual issue as to what they're telling you, that he is a criminal because he told us, but they just wouldn't take it on board. He was a sexual offender, and they dragged it out. That was the whole thing with the DPP. They dragged it out. So it looked as though he was guilty and trying to get away with a criminal act. They were very clever. And I disagree with Chris. I don't think everybody in the Labour Party, even the Parliamentary Labour Party, you see, I'm not one of these that you throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think there are decent people. And I think there are people who think the way we do. It's just that at the moment, the climate is it's a dying empire. We are part of an Anglo-American dying empire. And this is what dying empires do. And we have to rise from those ashes, you might say. So I don't think that we should just say, you're good, you're bad. I think we've got to find a way to get all these forces that realize what's going on together. That's the only way we'll win, because that's the only way we'll persuade people. We won't persuade people otherwise. They'll just take the line, oh, well, Julian's a sexual offender. We don't have any truck with him. You know, they're very clever.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting that the case was always kept, there were never any charges in Sweden ever raised. The case was always kept in preliminary investigation stage, so that he did not have a right to the exculpatory evidence. He offered to be interviewed. He was not interviewed, thanks to Keir Starmer's people saying, don't you dare get cold feet. This is not being treated like any other extradition. But while we're on the subject, in terms of political movement, I think I just want to firstly highlight that Jeremy, John McDonnell, Richard Bergen and Diane have all come out very publicly and more recently outside Belmarsh prison at that event, which it would, you know, I'm very sympathetic to what Chris says. And I would say I would have liked to see them out a lot louder and a lot stronger, a lot earlier. But it's nice to have them out there. And in fact, many of the media organizations are now saying, oh no, we shouldn't extradite Assange. But what's really important and what will make a difference to this case is the presence on the 27th of October outside the Royal Courts of Justice. There is a protest at 9 a.m. and I would encourage everybody to please be there to show your support for Julian, because it is a very, very lonely place in Belmarsh. The other question I wanted to ask, and because I haven't, although Bjartmar has been here for an hour, I haven't really made the most of the questions that we wanted to ask you, because quite a lot of them are quite detailed. But one of the things I was really taken with was our discussion the other day about what do you say to people who say Julian isn't a journalist? And I wondered whether you could respond to that, Bjartmar.
I don't know, even it should be a question, because it isn't. It's just obvious. Of course, he's a journalist. He has information. He came out with that information, and that's what journalists does. Did he did it in a new way? Yes, but still, if you go into the deep end of it, it's still journalism. Journalism 101. There's nothing. I don't even know why people have this discussion, and that's why I think the United States government actually put this in the indictment. They actually tried to make him an hacker, and it's just strange to see that you have to have this discussion about this, because this is, as anybody can tell you who is in investigative journalism, you get information from places that you're not supposed to get those information from. And you give it to the public. So, and you write about them. And I have no other way even try to argue this better than just to say that he is completely 100% a journalist. Nothing more, nothing less.
Thank you. On that very positive note, I'd like to thank Lauri for staying awake in the middle of the night for you. Thank Bjartmar for joining us online from Iceland. Thank you very much, Matt, for your comments here. And thank you to the audience for all your questions and comments. Very grateful for your solidarity with Julian and with Craig. And I will take a message back to Craig of solidarity from this audience, because I will write to him tonight. And I I hope there will be an event in London for those of you who are based in London on the evening of the 26th, which is the night before the extradition hearings. And Bjartmar will be there, and so will a couple of other people like Andrew Feinstein and Lauri. And this time it will all be in person, and hopefully we will have a much more intense discussion as a result of the impending hearing. So I invite you to that event, and I thank you for your support of the Resist event today and for Julian. Good night, everybody.
Up the rebels.